All right, so picture this. It's 1946, and a farmer somewhere in the Midwest is standing in his field looking at what might be the strangest piece of farm equipment ever to roll off an American assembly line. It's got three wheels, not four, three. And it's sitting there, angled off to one side like it's already tipping over before he even climbs aboard. The engine's hanging out front like some mechanical tumor, totally exposed to the elements. The steering, well, we'll get to the steering in a minute, but let's just say it's not what you'd call intuitive. And the whole contraption is painted in that familiar Sears red. Because yes, you read that right, Sears, the department store. The same company that sold you your washing machine and your winter coat just decided to start selling tractors. And not just any tractor. They went ahead and designed one of the most mechanically bizarre, operationally questionable, and downright unsafe farm machines in American history. Welcome to the story of the David Bradley Tri-Trac. Now, before we dive into the madness of this three-wheeled fever dream, we need to understand the world it was born into. World War II had just ended. Millions of soldiers were coming home, and a lot of them were going back to farms. But farming, in 1946, was changing fast. The old draft horses were being put to pasture, literally. Tractors were becoming the standard, and the market was absolutely exploding. John Deere, International Harvester, Alice Chalmers, they were all fighting tooth and nail for dominance. But here's the thing. Not every farmer could afford a brand new John Deere Model A or an International Farmall. Those machines were expensive, and that's where Sears, Roebuck and Company saw an opportunity. Sears had been selling tractors since the 1910s under their own house brand, David Bradley, named after, well, nobody actually named David Bradley as far as anyone can tell. It was just a name that sounded trustworthy and American. The early David Bradley tractors were mostly rebranded models built by other manufacturers. Sears would contract with a smaller company, slap their name on it, and sell it through their catalog. Simple, effective, low risk. But after the war, Sears wanted something different, something unique, something that would stand out in the catalog pages and give them an edge over the big boys. And in 1946, they introduced the David Bradley Tri-Trac, a machine so unconventional, so mechanically odd, that it still baffles tractor historians today. Let's start with the most obvious question. Why three wheels? I mean, seriously, why? Four wheels had been the standard for basically as long as wheeled vehicles existed. Three-wheel designs showed up occasionally in experimental vehicles and oddball prototypes, but they were never mainstream. And there's a good reason for that. Stability. A four-wheel vehicle has a stable footprint. It distributes weight evenly. It doesn't tip over unless you're doing something catastrophically stupid. A three-wheel vehicle, on the other hand, is inherently unstable. It's always balancing on a triangle. And on uneven ground, which is, pretty much every farm field in America, that triangle can shift in ways that are, let's call them exciting, and not in a good way. But Sears and the engineers behind the Tri-Trac had a theory. They believed that a three-wheel design could offer superior maneuverability. The idea was that with two wheels in the back and one in the front, the tractor could make tighter turns than a traditional four-wheel machine. In theory, this would make it easier to navigate around obstacles, work in tight spaces, and reduce the turning radius in row crop farming. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, well, we'll get there. The Tri-Trac was built by the A.B. Farquhar Company of York, Pennsylvania, under contract for Sears. Farquhar had been around since the 1850s, originally building threshing machines and steam engines. By the 1940s, they were still in the farm equipment game, but they weren't exactly leading the industry. Building the Tri-Trac for Sears was supposed to be their big comeback, a chance to get their name, or at least the David Bradley name, onto thousands of farms across the country. What they actually built was a machine that would become a cautionary tale. The Tri-Trac used a Hercules IX-B3 engine, a four-cylinder overhead valve motor that produced around 23 horsepower at 1,800 RPM. Not bad for a small tractor in that era. The engine sat out front, ahead of the single front wheel, completely exposed. No hood, no cowling, just the engine block, carburetor, air cleaner, and all the associated plumbing sitting out in the open where dust, dirt, rain, and crop debris could get at it. The reasoning, supposedly, was accessibility. If something went wrong, you could see it and fix it right away, which sounds great until you realize that things went wrong constantly because the engine was exposed to everything the farm could throw at it. Behind the engine, the operator's seat was mounted directly over the rear axle, and this is where things start to get really strange. The seat was offset to the left side of the tractor, not centered, offset. Why? Because the single front wheel was also offset to the left. The entire machine was asymmetrical. When you sat in the seat and looked forward, the front wheel was directly in front of your left knee, and the engine was hanging out to the right. It was disorienting. It felt wrong, and it made the already questionable balance of a three-wheeled machine even worse. The steering mechanism was... I'm trying to find a charitable way to describe this. It was a nightmare. The front wheel was connected to the steering wheel by a series of linkages and universal joints that ran back along the left side of the tractor. When you turned the steering wheel, the front wheel pivoted, but because of the offset design and the weird geometry of the linkages, the steering response was unpredictable. Small inputs at the wheel could result in jerky, exaggerated movements of the front wheel, and on uneven ground, the front wheel would catch on ruts, rocks, or furrows, sending feedback through the steering column that could damn near rip the wheel out of your hands. Farmers who operated the Tri-Trac quickly learned to hold the steering wheel with a loose grip, because if you fought it, you'd lose it. The rear axle was narrow, really narrow. The two rear wheels were spaced close together, which again was supposed to help with row crop work, but it also meant that the tractor's center of gravity was high and its footprint was small. Combine that with the offset seat, the offset front wheel, and the exposed engine weight hanging out front, and you had a machine that wanted to tip over. Not sometimes, constantly. If you hit a slope, it would lean. If you turned too sharp, it would lean. If you drove over a furrow at the wrong angle, it would lean. And sometimes it wouldn't just lean, it would go all the way over. So you've got this fundamentally unstable machine sitting in a farmer's field, and the farmer, probably a guy who just came back from fighting in Europe or the Pacific, is looking at it thinking, well, Sears sold it to me, so it must be all right. And here's the thing, Sears had a reputation. They were trusted. If you bought something from the Sears catalog, you expected it to work. You expected it to be safe. You expected it to last. The Tri-Trac did not meet those expectations. Let's talk about what it was like to actually operate this thing. You'd climb onto the seat, which was just a basic steel pan with minimal padding, no backrest, no suspension. The seat was bolted directly to a frame that sat over the rear axle, so every bump, every rut, every rock went straight through the frame into your spine. The operator's platform was small and open. There were no fenders, no roll bar, no safety features whatsoever. You were just sitting there, totally exposed, trying to keep this unbalanced machine pointed in the right direction. Starting the engine required a hand crank. The Tri-Trac did not come with an electric starter as standard equipment. Some later models had optional starters, but most of them relied on a good old-fashioned crank handle. You'd set the throttle, set the choke, walk around to the front of the engine, insert the crank, and give it a few solid pulls. If you were lucky, the Hercules 4-cylinder would cough to life. If you were unlucky, the engine would backfire and the crank handle would kick back and break your wrist. This was not a theoretical risk. It happened. Frequently. Once the engine was running, you'd climb back onto the seat and engage the transmission. The Tri-Trac used a sliding gear transmission with 3 forward speeds and 1 reverse. Shifting required double clutching and a fair amount of muscle. The gear lever was a long, unforgiving stick that stuck up out of the transmission housing on the right side of the seat. The clutch pedal was on the left. The brake was on the right. Except, and this is important, the brake only worked on the rear wheels. And since the rear wheels were so close together, braking often had the effect of making the tractor pivot rather than stop. If you were on a slope and you hit the brake, the tractor would swing around like it was trying to spin out. And if you weren't ready for it, you were going for a ride. The power takeoff, or PTO, was mounted on the rear of the tractor. This was how you'd drive implements like mowers, balers, or saws. The PTO shaft spun at 540 RPM, which was standard for the era. But here's the problem. The PTO was always live. There was no independent clutch for it. If the engine was running, the PTO was spinning. And that meant if you climbed off the tractor to adjust an implement, or if you stumbled getting on or off, there was a real chance you'd get caught by that spinning shaft. Entanglement injuries from PTO shafts were already a leading cause of farm accidents in the 1940s. The Tri-Trac's design made it worse. The hydraulic system was almost non-existent. The Tri-Trac had a belt pulley on the side for running stationary equipment, but it didn't have a proper hydraulic lift for implements. If you wanted to raise or lower a plow or cultivator, you did it manually. You'd stop the tractor, climb off, walk back, adjust the hitch by hand, and hope you got it level. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was slow. And on a farm, slow means less work gets done. Less work means less money. And when you're competing with guys running modern farm hauls or John Deeres with hydraulic lifts, you're already behind. But the worst part, the truly dangerous part, was the tipping. Farmers who owned Tri-Tracs reported rollovers constantly. If you were plowing and you hit a buried rock, the front wheel would kick sideways and the whole tractor would start to lean. If you were pulling a heavy load uphill, the weight would shift backwards, lifting the front wheel off the ground, and the tractor would rear up. And if you were working on a hillside, even a gentle slope, the machine could tip over sideways without warning. There are documented cases of operators being crushed when the Tri-Trac rolled over. There are reports of farmers jumping clear just in time. And there are stories, impossible to verify but repeated often enough to carry weight, of Tri-Tracs ending up on their sides, in ditches, in creek beds, in fields, abandoned where they fell because it wasn't worth the trouble to right them. Sears didn't advertise these problems, obviously. In the catalogs, the Tri-Trac was presented as a modern, efficient, affordable solution for small farmers. The illustrations showed it working smoothly in neat, flat fields. The copy emphasized maneuverability, simplicity, and value. What the catalogs didn't mention was that the machine was a death trap, and as word spread, sales slowed. Dealers who had ordered Tri-Tracs found them sitting unsold on their lots. Farmers who bought them tried to trade them in, and Sears quietly started backing away from the design. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. Because the Tri-Trac wasn't just a failure, it was an embarrassment. And for Sears, a company that prided itself on trust and quality, that was a problem they couldn't ignore. By 1948, less than 2 years after the Tri-Trac's introduction, Sears stopped selling it. They didn't recall the machines, they didn't offer refunds, they just stopped. New inventory was quietly liquidated, advertising disappeared, and the David Bradley tractor line moved on to other models, mostly rebranded versions of tractors built by other manufacturers, safer, proven designs that wouldn't kill anyone. But the Tri-Tracs that had already been sold, those were still out there, and they were still being used, because farmers in the 1940s didn't throw away equipment just because it was dangerous. Equipment was expensive. If you bought a tractor, you used it until it literally couldn't run anymore. So Tri-Tracs kept operating, kept tipping over, kept injuring people for years after Sears had moved on. The engineering problems with the Tri-Trac weren't subtle, they were fundamental. The three-wheel design was inherently unstable, and no amount of operator skill could fully compensate for that. The offset front wheel created unpredictable steering dynamics that made the machine difficult to control. The exposed engine was vulnerable to damage and required constant maintenance. The lack of hydraulics made implement work slow and labor-intensive, and the live PTO was a safety hazard that violated basic principles of machine design. What's fascinating and kind of infuriating is that none of these problems were unknown at the time. By the mid-1940s, tractor design had already evolved to the point where most of these issues had been solved. Four-wheeled tractors with centered steering, enclosed engines, hydraulic lifts, and independent PTO clutches were widely available. The major manufacturers, John Deere, International Harvester, Alice Challis, they had all figured this out. The Tri-Trac wasn't pushing the boundaries of innovation, it was going backward. It was taking established, proven technology and replacing it with something cheaper, weirder, and worse. Why did Sears and Farquhar think this was a good idea? Cost. The Tri-Trac was cheap to build. Eliminating one wheel saved money. Leaving the engine exposed saved money. Skipping hydraulics saved money. Using a simple, underpowered transmission saved money. The entire machine was an exercise in cost-cutting, and the assumption, apparently, was that farmers wouldn't care, that they'd be so focused on the low price that they wouldn't notice or wouldn't mind that they were buying a fundamentally flawed machine. That assumption was wrong. Farmers aren't stupid. They know equipment. They know what works and what doesn't, and they know when they're being sold garbage.
The Tri-Trac's failure wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a failure of respect. Sears looked at their customer base and decided that a cheap, dangerous machine was good enough for them, and the market responded by rejecting it. But the legacy of the Tri-Trac didn't end with its commercial failure. It became a cautionary tale within the industry, a reminder that you can't cut corners on safety, that novelty for its own sake is worthless if the product doesn't work, and that customers, even budget-conscious customers, will only tolerate so much before they walk away. In the decades since, the Tri-Trac has achieved a kind of cult status among tractor collectors, not because it's admired, but because it's so bizarre. It's a curiosity, a mechanical oddity, a what-were-they-thinking conversation piece. Surviving examples are rare, mostly because so many of them were scrapped or abandoned. The ones that do survive are usually in rough shape, rusty, incomplete, missing parts that were never easy to find even when the tractor was new. Restoring a Tri-Trac is an exercise in frustration. Parts don't exist, documentation is scarce, and even when you get one running, you're left with a machine that's still fundamentally unsafe to operate.
Let's talk about what actually happens when a Tri-Trac tips over. Because this wasn't a rare event. This was a regular, predictable consequence of the machine's design. And understanding why it happened, mechanically, tells you everything you need to know about why this tractor was such a disaster. A tractor's stability depends on its center of gravity and its footprint. The center of gravity is the point where all the weight of the machine is balanced. The footprint is the area between the wheels. On a four-wheeled tractor, the footprint is a rectangle. The center of gravity sits somewhere inside that rectangle, usually toward the rear because that's where the engine and transmission are. As long as the center of gravity stays inside the footprint, the tractor stays upright. If the center of gravity moves outside the footprint, the tractor tips. On the Tri-Trac, the footprint was a triangle, two rear wheels close together and one front wheel offset to the left. The center of gravity was high because the engine was mounted up front and the seat was elevated over the rear axle. And because the front wheel was offset, the triangle was asymmetrical. This created a situation where the center of gravity was already close to the edge of the footprint even when the tractor was sitting still on level ground. Now add in movement. When you're driving forward, the front wheel is tracking along the ground, but it's also steering. Every time you turn, the front wheel pivots and the triangle shifts. If you turn left, the front wheel moves even further to the left, narrowing the base of the triangle on that side. If you're on a slope, or if the ground is uneven, or if you're pulling a load, the center of gravity shifts too. And if the shift happens too fast or too far, the center of gravity moves outside the footprint, and the tractor tips. This wasn't theoretical, this was physics, and it was predictable. But apparently nobody at Sears or Farquhar bothered to do the math, or if they did, they decided it was acceptable, which is even worse. The consequences were brutal. When a Tri-Trac tipped, it tipped fast. There was no gentle roll. The machine would lean and then suddenly it would go over. If the operator was lucky, they'd have time to jump clear. If they weren't, they'd be crushed. The lack of a roll bar meant there was no protection. The operator was completely exposed, and the weight of the tractor, around 2,000 pounds depending on configuration, was more than enough to cause fatal injuries. Farm accidents were already a serious problem in the 1940s. Tractors were getting faster and more powerful, but safety features hadn't caught up. Roll bars wouldn't become standard until the 1960s and 70s. Seat belts on tractors were almost unheard of, and most farmers operated alone, which meant if something went wrong, there might not be anyone around to help. The Tri-Trac made all of these problems worse. It was a machine designed without regard for the safety of the person operating it. And here's the thing, other companies were doing better. International Harvester's Farmall Cub, introduced in 1947, was a small, affordable tractor aimed at the same market Sears was targeting. And it was safe. 4 wheels, low center of gravity, reliable steering. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't tip over every time you looked at it sideways. John Deere's Model M, also introduced in the late 1940s, was another competitor. Same story. Safe, functional, well-designed. The Tri-Trac wasn't just worse than these machines, it was embarrassingly worse, and farmers knew it. By the early 1950s, the Tri-Trac was effectively dead.
Sears had moved on, Farquhar had moved on, the machines that were still in use were aging out, breaking down, being replaced, and the entire episode was quietly forgotten by everyone except the people who'd been hurt by it. There were no lawsuits, at least none that made it into public record, no government investigations, no regulatory changes. The Tri-Trac just faded away, a footnote in the history of American farm equipment, a mistake that didn't get repeated. But it's worth asking, how did this happen? How did a major American retailer, a company with decades of experience selling farm equipment, end up putting their name on a machine this bad? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to a few key failures. First, cost cutting. Sears wanted a cheap tractor, and they prioritized price over safety. Second, poor engineering. The design was flawed from the start, and nobody caught it, or nobody cared. Third, lack of testing. If the Tri-Trac had been properly tested in real-world conditions, the problems would have been obvious, but it wasn't. It was rushed to market. And fourth, arrogance. Sears assumed that their brand was strong enough to sell anything, that farmers would buy whatever they put in the catalog. They were wrong.
So what's the legacy of the David Bradley Tri-Trac? On the surface, not much. It was a commercial failure, it disappeared from the market within 2 years, and today it's remembered, if it's remembered at all, as a weird curiosity, a mechanical oddity that collectors find interesting but nobody actually wants to use. But dig a little deeper, and the Tri-Trac tells a bigger story. It's a story about the dangers of prioritizing cost over safety, about what happens when companies assume their customers don't know any better, and about the consequences of bad engineering in an industry where mistakes can kill people. The tractor industry learned from the Tri-Trac, even if the lesson was mostly about what not to do. By the 1950s and 60s, safety became a bigger priority. Roll bars started appearing on new models. PTO shields became standard. Hydraulic systems improved, making implements easier and safer to operate, and the industry moved away from experimental designs like the three-wheeled layout in favor of proven, stable configurations. But the Tri-Trac also serves as a reminder that progress isn't linear, that even in an era of rapid technological advancement, companies can still make catastrophically bad decisions, and the people who suffer the consequences are often the ones with the least power to fight back. The farmers who bought Tri-Tracs didn't have legal recourse. They didn't have consumer protection agencies. They just had a dangerous machine and the choice of either using it or taking the financial loss. Today, if you want to see a Tri-Trac, you'll probably have to visit a farm equipment museum or a collector's show. They're not common. Most of them were scrapped decades ago. The ones that survive are usually non-operational, displayed as historical artifacts rather than working machines. And that's probably for the best, because even now, more than 70 years after the Tri-Trac was introduced, it's still dangerous. The fundamental problems with the design haven't gone away. The machine is still unstable, the steering is still unpredictable, and the exposed engine is still vulnerable. But there's something almost poetic about the Tri-Trac's failure. It represents a moment when American industry got too clever for its own good, when a company tried to reinvent something that didn't need to be reinvented and ended up creating something worse. The tractor had been perfected, more or less, by the 1940s. 4 wheels, reliable engine, good steering, basic safety features. It worked. But Sears looked at that and thought, what if we did it differently? What if we made it cheaper, weirder, and just a little bit worse? And the market, in its infinite wisdom, said no. The Tri-Trac is a lesson in humility, a reminder that sometimes the old way is the right way, that innovation for its own sake is worthless if it doesn't improve the product, and that in industries where lives are on the line, safety can't be an afterthought. If you ever get the chance to see a Tri-Trac in person, take it. Stand next to it. Look at the offset front wheel, look at the exposed engine, look at the tiny operator's platform with no protection, no roll bar, nothing between the driver and the ground, and ask yourself how anyone ever thought this was a good idea. Because the answer to that question tells you a lot about the pressures, the assumptions, and the failures that shaped American industry in the post-war era. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds us to think a little harder before we cut corners in the name of saving a few dollars.